The emergency room has a sound all its own, a chorus of machines, urgent footsteps, and the thin rasp of breath caught between life and silence. To most, those sounds fade into background noise. But to the respiratory therapists who live by every rise and fall of a chest, they are signals that can't be ignored. Tonight's accounts are not drawn from textbooks or staged dramas. They are testimonies whispered after long shifts, stories of patients who slipped into shadows, of cases that bent medicine into mystery, and once heard, they are impossible to forget. The fluorescent lights of the Tucson ER never dim, but on that summer night, their hum seemed louder than usual. The air was dry, static clinging to the skin, carrying the faint scent of ozone and disinfectant. The respiratory therapist had worked countless shifts, but this night carried a weight she couldn't name. The patient who arrived wasn't unusual at first glance. Middle-aged, short of breath, lungs laboring against the desert air. Yet something in the rhythm of his struggle unsettled her. Every inhalation sounded like a countdown. Every exhalation echoed longer than it should. The desert has a way of pressing in on a person at night. In the daylight, Tucson's heat can be cruel, but at midnight, it's the silence that suffocates. Outside the ER at St. Catherine's Medical Center, the parking lot shimmered under buzzing sodium lamps, heat still bleeding up from the asphalt. Inside, the fluorescent hum was its own kind of oppressive, steady and merciless, filling every corner of the trauma base. She had worked here long enough to know the rhythms of the place. Nights start slow, almost sleepy, and then, without warning, they unravel. Code blues, paramedic calls, families pressing against glass. The chaos rises and falls in waves. She thought she'd seen it all. But on that particular night, when the charge nurse muttered, "Respiratory on standby," something in the air shifted. The patient was a man in his mid-40s, brought in just after midnight. He'd been struggling with shortness of breath for hours before his wife finally called 911. The paramedics wheeled him in pale and sweating, his chest rising in rapid, shallow jerks. Asthma, COPD, heart failure. At first it could have been any of them. The monitors were clipped on, leads tracing across his damp skin. Numbers began to scroll on the screen, but before she could trust them, she trusted the sound, the desperate rasp of lungs clawing for air. That sound was her world. For a respiratory therapist, it always is. She knew breath like others knew music. She could tell the difference between fluid in the lungs and tightened airways by a single strained exhalation. But tonight, she couldn't place what she was hearing. It wasn't wheeze. It wasn't crackle. It was hollow. Each breath carried a strange echo, as if his lungs were opening into a space larger than his body. She leaned closer, stethoscope poised, and heard it again, a void where there should have been friction. "His SATs are low," a nurse called, pointing at the monitor. "Oxygen at 82, dipping lower." Alarms chirped, a steady warning that time was slipping. She placed the mask carefully, adjusted the flow, watched the man's chest. For a moment his shoulders eased, but the numbers refused to climb. His wife was clutching the doorway, whispering his name like a mantra. The ER doctor glanced at her. "What do you think?" She didn't answer right away, because what she wanted to say didn't make sense. The air was going in. She could hear it. She could feel it under her hands as his chest expanded. But his body wasn't receiving it. It was as though the oxygen vanished somewhere between breath and blood, swallowed by an emptiness no monitor could chart. The man's eyes fluttered open, locking onto hers, wide, panicked, but also strangely aware. He mouthed a word, maybe her name, though they had never met. Then he gasped, a jagged inhale that rattled through the mask, and the sound hollowed out again, deeper this time. It was then that she noticed something stranger still. The numbers on the monitor didn't sync with his breaths. Normally, saturation lags a little behind effort, but this was different. Each time he inhaled, the line flattened instead of rising, as if the act of breathing drained something from him rather than restoring it. She blinked, certain she was misreading in the rush of adrenaline, but the discrepancy held. The machine was lying, or the body was. And she couldn't decide which possibility frightened her more. Around her, the ER tightened into its usual routine. Blood gas ordered, IV fluids hung, orders barked. But she kept hearing that echo, hollow and endless, layered beneath every alarm. It wasn't just inside his lungs anymore. It was filling the room, seeping into the sterile air. She wanted to tell herself it was fatigue, the kind that comes after too many night shifts strung together. But something about the way the man gripped her wrist said otherwise. His touch was weak, trembling, but his eyes fixed on her with a plea she couldn't name. He seemed to know she heard it too. The sound no one else reacted to, the sound that didn't belong in any hospital. Minutes stretched. She worked mechanically, adjusting, recording, charting. All the while she was aware of the motif repeating. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the faint rattle of an oxygen cylinder at her side, and beneath it all, that hollow resonance. It followed every breath, every monitor beep, like the shadow of a heartbeat that never came. By the time the doctor leaned over to say, "We may need to intubate," she already knew this case would not resolve the way anyone expected. Because in her gut, before the tube, before the crash, before the last breath, she felt the truth clawing up from the silence. Something had already taken hold of him. And it was something no medicine in that room could reach. The decision to intubate always marks a point of no return. In the ER, it is the sharp line between hope and inevitability. For the respiratory therapist, it was a familiar ritual. Equipment checked, blade ready, tube measured and prepared. But tonight, each step carried an undercurrent she couldn't shake. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the room resisted what was about to happen. She slid into position, gloves tight against her wrists, stethoscope pushed back. The doctor gave the nod. The patient's jaw slackened under sedation, his chest laboring even as the medication slowed him. For a moment, she expected the usual resistance, the struggle against drowning lungs. Instead, he relaxed too quickly, as if something had been waiting for the chance to take over once his defenses fell. The laryngoscope's light cut through the darkness of his throat. She advanced the tube smoothly, guided by reflexes carved from 100 prior intubations. Placement confirmed, she secured it, ventilator attached. The machine breathed for him now, delivering air in precise, rhythmic volumes. And that was when the anomaly sharpened. Every mechanical breath inflated his chest, but no oxygen registered. The monitor's numbers should have climbed, steadied, reflected the steady work of the ventilator. Instead, the waveform flattened further, as though the machine was pumping air into a void. "Check the connections," the physician ordered sharply. Tubing was inspected, circuit intact, no kinks, no leaks, everything was correct. The therapist pressed her stethoscope to his chest again. The ventilator whooshed, forcing air in. She should have heard the crisp, bilateral breath sounds, equal on both sides. But in the left lung, there was nothing. In the right, only that hollow resonance, deeper now, as though the air traveled into a cavern that shouldn't exist inside the human body. "Maybe a tension pneumothorax," the resident suggested, already reaching for a needle, but her instinct screamed otherwise. The percussion note on his chest wasn't hyper-resonant, it was empty. A silence that swallowed sound itself. She tried to voice her hesitation. It doesn't sound like air at all." The doctor frowned. "Then what does it sound like?" She hesitated, because the words felt absurd. But she said them anyway, like space, like it's opening into somewhere else. The room stilled for a beat too long. The monitors beeped steadily, discordant with the panic in her chest. His wife pressed closer to the bed, eyes darting between the screens and her husband's pale face. "Why aren't the numbers changing? He's breathing. I can see him breathing." The therapist wanted to tell her the truth, that what they saw didn't match what the body should be doing. But she bit it back, because sometimes silence is the only mercy left. Still, the contradiction grew unbearable. The ventilator pushed air in, the chest rose, but the pulse oximeter read 72, dipping into the red. The man's lips darkened, despite the machine's relentless efforts. Then, without warning, the monitor itself stuttered. For one impossible second, the waveform inverted, tracing a pattern she had never seen before, as if breath itself had reversed direction, pulled inward instead of delivered outward. A tray rattled at the edge of the bay, stainless steel quivering as though from a tremor. No one touched it. The therapist's hands trembled around the tube. She forced herself still, whispering more to herself than anyone else. The machine is lying, or he is. The doctor didn't argue this time. He simply stared at the monitor, jaw tight, as though wrestling with an explanation that refused to come. Somewhere in the corner, the HVAC system hummed low, almost indistinguishable from the hollow resonance in the man's chest. The two sounds braided together until she could no longer tell which was machine and which was him. And then, as if to answer the unspoken dread, his eyes snapped open against sedation. For a fraction of a second, he was fully present, gaze cutting through the chaos. His lips moved around the tube, soundless but deliberate. She leaned closer, and though no air passed, she swore she heard the words in her head. "It's not breathing me. I'm breathing it." Her blood ran cold. Because whatever it was, she realized the man wasn't just suffocating, he was being claimed. The words echoed inside her, though no air had carried them. "It's not breathing me. I'm breathing it." For a second, she thought she'd imagined it, the product of fatigue and adrenaline. But then the monitor flatlined into an unfamiliar rhythm. Not the sharp plateau of cardiac arrest, not the erratic tremor of arrhythmia. Instead, it pulsed in reverse, tracing dips and valleys against the screen, as though mapping something other than a human body. Alarms screamed. A code was called. Nurses rushed in with the crash cart, paddles primed. The physician barked orders in clipped urgency. But the respiratory therapist stood frozen, stethoscope pressed against the man's chest, listening. What she heard made no sense. Breath that wasn't air, movement that wasn't lungs. The ventilator pushed, but instead of inflating, it seemed to draw. The machine became the patient, and the patient became the void. The doctor's voice cut sharp. "Step back, we'll shock him." She obeyed mechanically, retreating just enough to watch the paddles meet skin. The first jolt lit the man's body, his frame convulsing in the harsh fluorescent glare. For an instant, the monitor aligned. Oxygen blipped upward. Pulse returned. Hope fluttered. Then came the second breath, hollow, endless. The numbers dropped lower than before. "Again," the doctor commanded, sweat gleaming at his temple. Another jolt, another convulsion. And this time, the tray in the corner clattered violently, toppling instruments onto the floor. None of the staff touched it. None of them looked directly at it. The therapist's gaze flicked from the chaos to the man's face. His eyes were still open, but there was no panic now, only stillness. A strange calm, as if he were no longer fighting. She stepped closer despite herself. "Hold on," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was pleading with anymore. The patient, or whatever, had come to claim him. Then, in a moment that split the room in two, his body exhaled on its own. Not with the ventilator, not with the machine. A long, low breath that rattled out from somewhere deeper than lungs. The ventilator alarmed in protest, as though its circuitry recognized the reversal. And with that exhale, the lights above flickered. Everyone froze. For a heartbeat, the hum of the fluorescence died, leaving the bay in silence, except for the hollow resonance still rolling out of him. When the power snapped back, the monitor was blank. No pulse, no saturation, no trace at all. Time of death was called minutes later, though every person in that room knew the patient had left long before the official words. The respiratory therapist stood at the bedside long after the others moved on, hands still trembling. She told herself it was exhaustion, that equipment fails, that bodies fail harder, but deep down, she couldn't forget what she had heard. The monitor lying. The lungs echoing into nothing. The whispered phrase that should have been impossible. Later, when the wife was led away, sobbing into the hallway, the therapist caught her eye. For just a moment, the woman looked back at her as though she knew. As though she had heard it too. And that was the part she could never let go of. Because in every code sense, every ventilator alarm, every hollow gasp she has answered, she listens for it. The sound of breath that doesn't belong to the living. The sound that reminds her the ER isn't just a place between sickness and health. It's a threshold. And sometimes, something else waits on the other side of that threshold, patient as the desert night. The fluorescent lights hummed again, steady, indifferent. But to her, their tone would never be the same. She had learned that night the ER is not only where life teeters on the edge of death. It is where silence sometimes breathes louder than the living. Some cases end with silence, others with questions. But for the therapists who live by every breath, the shadows don't always wait until the patient is gone. Sometimes they arrive first. The shift was half over when she first noticed it. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m., that strange dead hour when the ER is both restless and still. Outside, the desert winds pushed grit across the empty ambulance bay, scraping faintly against the metal doors. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and metal, the scent of battles already fought tonight. She was a respiratory therapist of 10 years, steady, competent, unshaken by routine codes. Yet she would later say this case unnerved her before she even touched the patient. He was wheeled in by paramedics, a teenager no older than 17, his skin pale against the straps of the gurney. His chart noted shortness of breath after a sudden collapse at home. No prior history, no smoking, no asthma. As the staff clustered around, she hung back for a beat, listening. That was always her first instinct, to listen, to the rhythm of the chest, to the pitch of a wheeze, to the truth behind the numbers. What she heard this time was wrong, in a way she couldn't define. His breaths were shallow, yes, but it wasn't weakness alone. Each inhalation scraped like sand dragged across glass. Each exhalation stopped short, cut off too early, as though some unseen weight pressed down on him from within. Airway clear, a nurse reported, tilting the boy's chin, suction ready. But the therapist shook her head. It wasn't obstruction. It was something else. Something that didn't belong in lungs at all. The monitor flickered on, numbers scrolling. At first glance, they looked deceptively stable. Oxygen hovering near 94, pulse steady at 80. But the boy's lips told another story. They were dusky, tinged with cyanosis, and the subtle panic in his eyes told her he was drowning without water. His SATs don't match his face, she muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. The attending glanced her way. We'll run labs. Get him on O2. She fitted the mask, oxygen hissing into place. The boy's chest rose and fell, but the sound of it scraped raw, harsh, unnatural. She bent close with her stethoscope, listening, brow furrowing. In the right lung, nothing but dull silence. In the left, faint vibrations that made her think less of air and more of movement, as though something was shifting inside, restless and foreign. The boy's eyes darted toward her then, sudden and sharp, locking with hers in a way that startled her. His lips parted beneath the mask. No sound came out, but she read the shape of the word clearly. Don't. And in that moment, she understood with icy clarity that what frightened him wasn't the thought of not breathing. It was the thought of what would happen if they forced him to. The boy's warning, that single, soundless don't, lingered in her mind even as the team pressed forward. Protocol demanded action. Hesitation was a luxury no ER shift could afford. The mask hissed with oxygen, straps tight against his temples. She adjusted the flow, watching the green waveform scroll across the monitor. To any outsider, he looked supported. But she couldn't ignore what her own senses told her. Every breath fought against something unseen, something not written in any chart. She leaned closer, stethoscope over the left lung. What she heard wasn't wheeze, wasn't crackle, wasn't the coarse rattle of fluid, it was vibration. A tremor deep inside, irregular but intentional, as though it pulsed in response to her listening. She drew back, unsettled, only to find the boy's gaze locked on her again. "Can you breathe for me?" she asked softly, though her words felt hollow in the fluorescent-lit bay. He shook his head. Barely. Slowly. The attending physician called for blood gases, labs, chest x-ray. Orders stacked. Nurses moved with swift precision. She prepped the boy for imaging, slipping leads into place. That was when she noticed it. Each time the oxygen mask inflated, his chest rose, but his pulse oximeter dropped instead of climbing. 78, a nurse muttered, frowning at the numbers. She tried again, adjusting the seal, flushing more O2. The boy's chest expanded obediently, but the line on the monitor sank lower. 75. 72. This can't be right, the physician said, checking the tubing. Machine's malfunctioning. But she knew it wasn't the machine. Machines lie sometimes, but not like this. This wasn't error. It was inversion. Each breath seemed to subtract from him, as though oxygen carried something out rather than in. She whispered, half to herself, half to anyone who might listen, "It's feeding something else." The doctor shot her a look, confusion mixed with irritation. "What are you saying?" She didn't answer. Because what could she say? That air itself was wrong inside this boy? That breath had become a currency he couldn't afford to spend? The X-ray tech arrived with the portable machine, maneuvering it into the bay. She helped steady the boy. Cold plates slid beneath his back. The machine clicked. Word captured its silent picture. The image processed on screen, and for a moment, no one spoke. His left lung didn't show the hazy white of pneumonia or the black void of a pneumothorax. Instead, it showed striations, faint, thread-like shadows that crisscrossed like veins, but not where veins should be. Lines that seemed to weave together, forming a pattern no anatomy text could explain. Artifact, the physician said too quickly, already turning to order a repeat. But she saw his hand tremble as he wrote. The boy moved then, struggling under the mask, hands twitching weakly. She reached for him, gripping his wrist to keep the lead secure. His fingers curled around hers with surprising strength, and once again his lips shaped a word she shouldn't have been able to hear. This time it wasn't "don't." It was inside. The sound, or maybe just the weight of it, reverberated in her skull like a whisper pressed too close to her ear. She flinched, heart pounding, eyes darting around the room. But no one else reacted. The nurses charted. The doctor typed. The hum of fluorescence filled the silence. Only she had heard it. And in that instant she knew with sick certainty that the boy wasn't warning her anymore. He was telling her the truth of what was happening. Whatever lived inside his lungs wasn't his alone. It was awake, and it had begun to answer back. The X-ray plate slid out, the machine wheeled away, but the image lingered on the monitor. Those thread-like shadows, twisting together like something woven, stared back at her more than she stared at them. The physician muttered about artifact, already ordering another scan, but his voice carried no conviction. The boy's oxygen saturation slipped lower. 69. 66. Alarms shrieked. Nurses scrambled, prepping for intubation. "Tube him now," the doctor ordered, sharp with fear. She hesitated. The boy's lips moved beneath the mask again, his eyes blazing with desperate clarity. "Don't." The word shaped in silence, but she felt it, as sure as if he'd screamed. She swallowed, throat dry. "Doctor," she began, but the look she received cut her off. This wasn't a debate. It was life or death. The kit was opened. Gloves snapped. Blade ready. She positioned herself by reflex, but her hands shook in a way they never had before. She knew what was about to happen would not save him. It would feed whatever had taken root inside. The mask came off. The boy drew in one raw, ragged breath on his own. And the sound froze everyone. Not a wheeze, not a rattle. A chorus, a faint, layered susurration, like dozens of voices exhaling at once from a single throat. Her stomach lurched. She forced the tube forward, heart hammering. Placement confirmed. The ventilator hissed, driving air in controlled volumes. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the monitor erupted. Oxygen should have risen. Instead, the numbers plunged. 59, 52, 48, free-falling as though dragged down by invisible hands. And the boy's chest convulsed. Not in seizure, not in struggle, in rhythm, as though something inside him was breathing back. The striations she had glimpsed on the X-ray seemed to move beneath his skin, faint impressions shifting like roots pressed under thin earth. "Pull the tube!" she cried, shocking herself with the outburst. But it was too late. The ventilator roared, alarms wailing, every cycle forcing air where it didn't belong. The boy's body arched, back bowing off the gurney, eyes rolled white. And then, with one shuddering exhalation, the overhead fluorescents flickered violently, casting the room in strobe flashes of shadow. The crash cart rattled. A tray toppled. Papers lifted from a counter, as though pulled by a draft. Only, there was no draft. There was only breath. A current of air that didn't come from ducts or machines, but from the boy himself. A gale of unseen force erupting out of him, chilling the bay. And then it stopped. The lights steadied. The room stilled. The monitor flatlined in stark silence. "Time of death," the physician said hoarsely, voice stripped of authority. The words landed flat, brittle. The staff dispersed slowly, muttering about equipment failure, about anomalies, about explanations none of them believed. Only she stayed rooted at the bedside. The boy's face was peaceful now, as though the battle had never touched him. But his last look haunted her. Because in those final seconds, before the monitor went dark, his gaze had locked on hers again. Not pleading, not fearful. Warning. She packed up her equipment with mechanical precision, gloves stripped, tube coiled. But as she turned away, she caught it. The faintest hiss from the ventilator tubing, still attached, though powered off. It exhaled once, hollow, whispered, "Inside." Her breath caught. She tore the tube free, shoving it into the biohazard bin as though distance could erase it. But nothing would erase the sound. Nothing would erase the certainty that whatever had lived inside that boy hadn't died with him. It had only slipped free. The ER hummed back to normal. Monitors beeped. Nurses laughed softly down the hall. But to her, every breath since has carried an edge. Because she learned that night, the air we trust to sustain us may not always be ours alone. Sometimes, it belongs to something waiting, patient and unseen, inside the silence of our lungs. Some confessions are about the moment breath stops. Others about the moment breath changes. But the one you'll hear now is about what happens when breath itself becomes the threat. The hospital night shift always carries its own weight, but some nights bend under it. At Redwood Memorial, tucked against the edge of the Northern California coast, fog pressed heavy against the windows, wrapping the ER in damp silence. The air tasted faintly of salt and bleach, a mixture that clung to skin and clothing alike. The respiratory therapist on call had been working double shifts for weeks, the kind of grind that strips away hours and leaves only routines. Oxygen checks, ventilator settings, suction prep. She knew every sound by heart. The soft rattle of tubing, the steady beep of saturation monitors, the coughs and groans of patients clinging to their own fragile rhythms. But this patient was different. He arrived just after 3 a.m, delivered by ambulance with no clear diagnosis. Mid-60s, disoriented, gasping as though drowning in dry air. His wife followed close behind, pale with fear, clutching a jacket to her chest as if it could shield her from what she'd just witnessed. Came on suddenly, the paramedic reported. No history. 1 minute he's fine, the next he's clawing at his throat. The therapist moved quickly, mask fitted, oxygen flowing. The man's chest heaved under her hands, each rise sharp, desperate, shallow. But it wasn't the struggle that unsettled her, it was the sound. Every inhalation hissed unnaturally long, like a vacuum seal broken and straining to hold. Every exhalation cut short, as though the air inside him refused to leave. It wasn't the rhythm of disease. It was the rhythm of something clinging on. The monitor flickered to life, numbers dancing across the screen. But the waveforms jittered, inconsistent, as though they were being pulled from two different bodies at once. His oxygen saturation hovered in the high 80s, then dropped suddenly into the 70s before rising again without explanation. She bent close with her stethoscope, listening carefully, blocking out the commotion of the ER around her. In the left lung, faint coarse sounds, consistent with fluid. In the right, silence. No air entry. But beneath that silence, a low vibration, a hum. At first, she thought it was feedback, interference from the monitors. But as she held her breath, pressing harder to the man's chest, she realized the vibration matched the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Perfectly. She froze. The patient's eyes opened then, bloodshot and wide, finding hers with startling focus. His lips parted, and though no sound came, his throat worked around a single word. She didn't need volume to understand it. Humming. And in that moment she knew. The sound filling his chest wasn't sickness, and it wasn't silence. It was the hospital itself, breathing through him. The fluorescent hum had always been there, a backdrop to every night shift. But hearing it inside a patient's chest was something she couldn't dismiss. It wasn't echo. It wasn't artifact. It was resonance. The hospital itself thrumming through him like a tuning fork struck too hard. She drew back, unsettled, pulse racing. The doctor, impatient with her hesitation, leaned in. "We need to stabilize him. Get labs, ABG, full panel." She nodded, forcing her hands steady as she adjusted the mask, increased the flow. Oxygen hissed, tubing rattled softly, but the numbers refused to behave. His oxygen saturation wavered like a bad signal, spiking into the 90s, then plunging without reason. The man gasped, chest heaving. His wife clutched the doorway, whispering his name. Each time he tried to breathe, the fluorescent lights above them flickered in rhythm, as though the hospital itself strained with him. She pressed her stethoscope back to his chest, driven by disbelief. This time, the vibration was stronger. A low, mechanical drone pulsed through his ribcage, too even to be human. It wasn't just inside him. It was around him. The walls themselves seemed to lean closer, listening. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, glancing at the nurse beside her. "Hear what?" The nurse was too busy charting vitals, unfazed. She swallowed hard. Only she could hear it. Only she could feel the hum growing louder with every inhale. Then the monitor twitched. For a split second, the oxygen waveform inverted, tracing downward spikes instead of upward peaks, the same unnatural reversal she'd only heard whispered about in other night shift stories. Her chest tightened. "It's not the machine," she said under her breath. "It's him," the doctor barked. "We'll intubate, prep." Her gut twisted. The boy in Tucson had mouthed "don't." The man in Tucson had whispered inside. And now this patient had said humming. All three warnings different, yet circling the same truth. Something in these rooms wanted breath, and it was no longer the patient's, alone. Still, protocol carried weight. She reached for the tube, hands trembling despite years of muscle memory. The ventilator was rolled close, its hiss ready. That was when the patient's body seized, not with the jerky chaos of a seizure, but in perfect stillness. His chest rose and locked, frozen mid-inhale, as though the hospital itself had drawn the breath and refused to release it. The fluorescence overhead dimmed, not flickering, but lowering, a deliberate shift into shadow. The hum grew louder, rattling trays, trembling through metal fixtures. Staff glanced up, startled, muttering about the power grid. But she knew better. She leaned in close, face inches from his. "Let it go," she whispered, though her voice cracked on the words. His eyes snapped open, bloodshot, wide, terrified. His lips moved once more, and this time she heard it as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. "It's not me humming, it's them." Her blood ran cold, because she realized in that sterile humming room, That he wasn't breathing with the hospital was breathing through him. The ventilator hissed, ready. The tray rattled against metal. Every detail of intubation was in place, yet no one moved. All eyes were on the man in the bed, his chest locked mid-inhale, his body held by something unseen. The fluorescent lights above dimmed further, humming in sync with the frozen rise of his ribs. Shadows pressed long against the walls, bending inward as though the whole ER bay leaned closer to watch. She forced herself forward, mask trembling in her grip. "We need to move," the doctor snapped, but his voice cracked on the word need. She pressed the laryngoscope into place, throat dry, hands mechanical. The tube slid easily, too easily, as if the body itself invited it in. The ventilator engaged, air pushed forward, volume steady. And then the room shuddered. Every breath the machine forced in bled outward, not just into his lungs, but into the walls themselves. The fluorescence pulsed with each hiss, growing louder, deeper, until the ER ceiling itself vibrated. Metal fixtures rattled. The crash cart trembled an inch across the floor. The monitor inverted. Waveforms scrawled backward, oxygen numbers dropping even as his chest inflated. The staff argued, "Check the leads. It's artifact. Switch machines." But their words drowned beneath the steady hum. She leaned close, stethoscope to his chest. What she heard wasn't human. It was the same resonance from above, magnified, layered, multiplied. Not a single tone, but dozens, hundreds, as though the entire hospital, every corridor, every vent, every machine, was exhaling through him. And then he opened his mouth. Not to gasp, not to cough, to speak. The sound that poured out wasn't words, not fully. It was vibration given shape. A chorus of low voices layered atop one another. The words formed slowly, unbearably. "We breathe you." Her hands tore away from the tube, horror flooding her chest. The ventilator screamed alarms, cycle interrupted. But the chorus continued, pouring out of him with no air source, no mechanics. The walls of the ER bay quivered, plaster vibrating in rhythm with his throat. His wife screamed. Staff backed away, fear spilling across faces trained never to show it. Only she stood rooted, every nerve screaming at her to run. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The lights steadied, the hum faded, the monitor flatlined into silence. Time of death was called, voice low, hesitant. The physician didn't look her in the eye. She removed the tube with shaking hands, setting it gently aside. The body lay still, face slack, chest empty, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing had left, that whatever had spoken through him had only quieted, slipping back into the hum of the walls. Later, alone in the supply room, she pressed her palms over her ears. But even in the silence, she could still hear it, faint, constant, threaded into the wiring, the vents, the very bones of the hospital. The humming never stopped. It never would. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her, steady, indifferent. Yet she knew now they were not background noise. They were breath. And every time she stepped into that ER, she carried the question that still steals her sleep. Who is breathing through whom?